I'm Bret Premack. This is Facebook Live with Neil Tesser. Neil is a writer, a broadcaster. He's written, hundreds of liner notes, thousands of articles. He's a Grammy. What did you win the Grammy for, Neil?
You mentioned hundreds. It really is around 470 sets of liner notes at this point, over what I often humorously refer to as my career. But the Grammy was for liner notes for the reissue of John Coltrane's album Afro Blue. Afro Blue Revisited, and which came out 4 or 5 years ago. And this was something that Coltrane had recorded in the 60s, but was never issued until the 70s. So this came out on the 40th anniversary of Pablo Records, the 40th anniversary of that actual album having come out, and I guess it was the 50th anniversary of the recording. Yeah, that was it.
Well, Pablo Records was started by Norman Granz, and if I'm not mistaken, wasn't it recorded in Europe when Coltrane was on a tour with Norman Granz?
Yes, Norman Granz, as a producer, was running concerts through Europe, and he recorded everything. Now, John Coltrane's music was not the kind of music at that time. John Coltrane, with his great quartet playing 15 and 18-minute versions of things, was not the kind of music that Norman Granz put out on his own labels. But it sat in the vaults for many years, and again, some 10 years or so after it was recorded, it was put out, less under Norman Granz's production supervision of the album, but wholly under his production supervision of the tour.
Interesting. Neil is also a broadcaster, a lot of radio, and you've got a radio project right now, Neil. Can you tell us about that, please?
It's called the WFMT Network's Jazz Radio Network. WFMT is a classical music station in Chicago, and for many years they've run several different networks. The Jazz Radio Network was started about 17, 18 years ago with Bob Parlocha, who many of the people watching will remember. Bob Parlocha passed away about 3 years ago, and eventually the folks at WFMT said, well, instead of working with somebody way on another coast, why don't we have people in Chicago who know some stuff about jazz, why don't we actually produce the show right here at home? So there's now 4 of us. One of my colleagues is the gifted vocalist Dee Alexander, who's made several albums under her own right, and together we produce the hours that go out to some 70 stations. It's a 9-hour block of programming every day that goes out, involving about half of new recordings, new shows that we record, and half hours from our archives. But it's a huge chunk of music, and as I say, it's on about 70 stations around the country, and a couple overseas, including in China, where the WFMT Classical Music Network has inroads. And so they said, well, we've got this too. And I actually met somebody, a radio journalist from China last year at the Chicago Jazz Festival, who told me he listens all the time and that he thought I was very funny. And I said, well, how do you know what I'm saying? I mean, what are you talking about? But it's kind of a kick.
Neil, how did you get into jazz?
My sophomore year at Northwestern University, after I had been doing a classical music program on the radio station, they gave my slot away to somebody else and said, well, we have a jazz slot, take it or leave it. So I went and started to listen, and did it under an assumed name because I knew I was going to make a lot of mistakes, and figured I'd go back to my classical music show after that. And after 3 or 6 months, I thought, no, this is where I want to be. The music just grabbed me, and I just started digging into everything I could.
And what was your introduction to Sonny Rollins?
Well, first Sonny Rollins album that I heard, I'm going to guess it was probably one of the things that came out in the 1970s or the late 60s, because that's when I was in college. Although it's very possible that I had heard some of the things that were in the library earlier, and that might have been A Night at the Village Vanguard, and very possibly Way Out West, the album that we're going to talk about here, that's going to be reissued. And my first experience hearing Sonny Rollins in person was sometime in the 1970s when Joe Siegel, the entrepreneur and impresario here in Chicago, brought him in for the for his jazz showcase, the nightclub that he's run in one venue or another for some 70 years. And so I would have seen him up close and personal then. And then many times here in Chicago at the Chicago Jazz Festival, which I helped program. So we were very fortunate to bring him in for his last appearance, I believe, in Chicago at all, which was about 10 years ago. And then I've gotten to know him from interviewing him and writing about his music. And it's one of my great pleasures to be somewhere in one of the distant orbits of Sonny Rollins' confidants.
We want to thank our viewers who are joining us here from, we have Copenhagen, Rio, Walla Walla, Washington, Bird in Hand, Pennsylvania.
Really?
Please leave your comments and questions here on Facebook. We'd love to interact with you. So, The Matter in Hand, Way Out West, a classic recording by any means. Neil, this was done in 1957?
Right.
That was a banner year for Mr. Rollins, wasn't it?
It really was. I mean, he had so much going on. Later that year, he recorded with the same idea of a pianoless trio, what we think of now as the power trio, tenor, bass, and drums. Later that year, he made the album's two recordings live at the Village Vanguard, which were just so spectacular for so many reasons. And he was recording on other people's albums. He was doing recordings with different size groups at the time. But Way Out West was the first album, and the first time anybody had recorded an album with tenor, bass, and drums. I mean, it turns out Lucky Thompson had recorded one tune in that format a year or two earlier that was on some collection. But I'm not sure it was a year or two, I should check. But only that one tune had ever appeared in this format. And this format that allowed so much freedom was to become Sonny Rollins' main vehicle for expression for the next 10 years. And then it influenced so many other people to try that, to the point where when it was once considered somewhat radical, how do you have a band without a piano or a guitar? How are you going to know where the chords are? Now it's common. I probably receive more recordings now in a trio format lacking a chord instrument, or at least as many, as I do in a conventional format. A lot of people do it. But it was Sonny Rollins' championing of that particular format, that particular context, that really led to this happening at all.
Hello, Las Vegas. Hello, Sydney, Australia. Neil, what is it about an improviser like Sonny Rollins? What is it about the way that he plays that seems to work so well within that trio context?
There's a wonderful book that was sort of my Bible when I was first getting into the music called The Jazz Tradition by Martin Williams. And his chapter on Sonny Rollins explains the whole idea of how Rollins could be essentially a one-man band, that he didn't need a chord instrument because the way he played was so rooted in the harmonies of the song that he could hint at or spell out the harmonies even while not playing those exact notes, that you didn't miss a chord-producing instrument. And that's one of the reasons I think that Sonny Rollins is good at this. But as he explained to me when we were talking for these liner notes, he always enjoyed playing alone. From the time he was a little kid and his mother brought him a saxophone, he liked to stay in his room and play without anyone else. And so this was kind of a seed that was planted very early. And as he progressed, he obviously enjoyed playing with other musicians, but he was never uncomfortable playing without the full complement of musicians. And in fact, the first time that Sonny Rollins was heard by Miles Davis, who then hired him to perform in his groups and on recordings, was in a setting where Sonny Rollins was playing not a pianoless trio, but a trio without drums. It was, I think that was it, I have to check, but it was piano, bass, and saxophone. And so, again, he was already working in a system where he had to supply more of the rhythm than the horn player usually would in such a situation. But beyond that, in Miles Davis's group, when Sonny Rollins was there, as he explains, they would occasionally have the piano stroll, they would say just stroll, which meant lay out, take a walk, and it would be one of the horn players playing with bass and drums. It would be Miles, it would be Sonny, later it would be Carnival Adderley. And through doing this, he became even more comfortable with the idea of a trio without piano. In essence, when he made Way Out West, he had already been playing in Miles Davis's group in a pianoless trio. It was just part of a pianoed quintet at different points in the performance.
Yeah. Hello to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Grand Rapids, Nebraska. Now, this is recorded in L.A. for Lester Koenig's Contemporary Records. Do you have any information, Neil, about how the session came about? I see on the next to the liner notes there's a union contract or something. It seems to say that the recording was done from 3 to 5 a.m. on a couple of nights. Oh, yeah.
I know it was very early in the morning because Sonny Rollins was there playing as part of the Max Roach Quintet. So after the quintet's regular performances at whatever club they were at, and I'm not sure which one it was, then Sonny and Ray Brown and Shelly Manne would go into the studio early morning and lay down these tracks.
And if I'm not mistaken, this is the first time he recorded with Ray Brown and Shelly Manne.
Oh, yeah. Shelly Manne was another New Yorker, like Sonny. I mean, born and bred in New York, but by then was living on the West Coast. Ray Brown had been in New York, even though he came up there from Pittsburgh. But so hearing especially these three East Coasters and especially two New York City natives playing this music that had a country and Western, or at least a Western cowboy theme to it on a couple of the tunes, was kind of ironic, but it worked great.
Well, with an iconic cover. With William Claxton, the great jazz photographer. Can you tell us something about the cover itself, Neil?
Well, I mean, I think you have the cover in the background there on your side there. I can describe it, certainly. It's a picture of Sonny Rollins. He's in a suit and tie, but he's wearing a 10-gallon hat and a holster and a gun belt, and he's got his tenor saxophone on his hip like it's a weapon. You know, it's instead of his 6-shooter, he's got a Selmer, and then you've got some sagebrush there, and you've got a cow's skull on the ground that is kind of in the same angle and almost mimicking the expression, or Sonny Rollins is almost mimicking the angle of the cow's skull in his stance. And you look at it and you go, wow, that's a riot. I mean, that's really funny. And it was Sonny Rollins' idea to do this. It was his idea to drive out to the desert. I believe that they brought the cow skull, or they found it and then placed it there. But it was Sonny's idea. It wasn't that William Claxton said, hey, I've got a great idea for this incredible photograph. He said, let's do it this way. We're out west. We're going to do some music that has to do with cowboy films, which were a favorite of Sonny's when he was growing up. And to this day, he still enjoys watching them. So it all came together.
Well, when Sonny Rollins was a young man, going to the movies every Saturday was an important part of his life. And a lot of music that was played in films became part of his repertoire. And if we listen to some of Sonny's extended saxophone cadenzas, he frequently throws in quotes from songs we would have never imagined that he knew or remembered. I know he recorded There's No Business Like Show Business, I'm an Old Cow Hand. Have you noticed that about Sonny's repertoire, Neil, how he brings in all kinds of stuff?
Of course, as you know, as many of the people watching know, he's famous for that. I mean, he has always taken music that you didn't expect would find its way into a jazz context and made it work. Other great musicians have done that. People who are definitely in Sonny Rollins' league. I mean, Louis Armstrong was famous for taking idiotic, really drivel from the popular music world of the day and turning them into masterpieces. And you mentioned There's No Business Like Show Business. That's one that I always point to because it's so. It's just such a perfect example of how, in playing the melody, he could sort of illuminate the chords, and then with one note which he uses, I think, in the second part of the A section. But he changes one note, which changes the chord, which automatically takes this song out of movie pop realm and makes it wonderfully hip. I mean, it makes it a jazz tune with one note. So he's always been a genius at doing this and in finding things that people didn't want to record before him, and he's done it right up until pretty much the end of his performing career. I mean, music from the pop world, things that he wrote in a pop vein. It's one of the things he's a genius at.
Yeah, one song that he played starting around 2000 recorded was a song called "Someday I'll Find You," and he got that song from the radio program Mr. Keen, Finder of Lost Persons, or something
really?
Like that. Sonny used to listen to the radio when he was a kid. Obviously, no
Sure.
TV, and he just remembered that. All of his life ended up recording that song. Neil and I are here because of the reissue of Way Out West, which is being offered by Craft Recordings. This is a subsidiary of Concord Records, and it's being released. It's been remastered, and it sounds great. And Neil redid the liner notes, and also there's some additional tracks on there, some alternative tracks, and it's being issued as an LP. So you can get the alternative cover here, has the alternative takes, and the regular recording. There's a little bit of talking here, and then of course it'll be in the usual places online: Amazon, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube.
See, I've never seen that alternate cover that you just showed me because I don't have the finished copy yet. So that's great. I mean, that's terrific. That's wonderful.
So sonically enhanced bonus tracks. We have the benefit of what Neil has to say, and something that I'm sure is going to be of interest to Sonny Rollins fans and music fans in general. Question here for Neil: any particular Sonny Rollins recording or performance that really stands out in your mind?
Many, as a matter of fact. I mean, this one, and the Village Vanguard, and of course the Bridge, and I've always been partial to Next Album because that was, I believe, the first one I heard, or at least the first new one I heard. It came out in �73 when I was in college and really digging into jazz. So those are four right off the bat. Well, of course, Saxophone Colossus, which has so many incredible performances. When you look at that one, you go, oh, they're all on this one album. That's unbelievable. And then things he did with Miles Davis, certainly the recordings that he did with Miles's group with Charlie Parker on the other tenor saxophone. Those are pretty cool to hear, to see how the baton gets passed. When you hear Sonny and Bird playing the same instrument, you can see how much Sonny Rollins got from Charlie Parker, but how much he built on it. So those things for sure. And then in terms of actual performances, I was just telling somebody about this last night. One of my favorite in-concert performances was, I can't remember how many years ago, I'm going to say 16, 17, at Symphony Center in Chicago. And at the time, Sonny Rollins was traveling with a quintet with his nephew, Clifton Anderson, who was the trombonist. And as anybody who's heard Sonny Rollins play and kind of hold court on stage, you have to know that being the second horn in Sonny Rollins' band would have to be the most thankless job in jazz. I mean, there's no way you can follow one of his solos. He doesn't really need you. I mean, he didn't, for many years, didn't even need a piano. So, but Clifton Anderson, who was his nephew, was a fine trombone player and was there sort of as a road manager too, and made some great frontline harmonies. But on this one night, Sonny announced that it was going to be a feature for Clifton. He said, right now we're going to do a feature for our trombonist, Clifton Anderson. And everybody sat back, and Sonny opened the tune out with a cadenza. And we're waiting for that to stop, and then Clifton Anderson's going to come in and have his part. But the cadenza keeps going and going and keeps going. And then finally it ends, and the feature for Clifton Anderson hasn't had a note from Clifton Anderson because Sonny had gotten sort of carried away with his cadenza. And I thought, well, that kind of epitomizes how much Sonny Rollins could play by himself or with a trio, or because here was the thing that was going to feature the other horn, and he never got to play. And I just thought that was perfect.
Sonny once told me that playing for him was a form of meditation.
Yeah.
I think that when he starts to improvise, whether he was in a room practicing by himself or up on the stage, he tries to enter a space where there's no thought, just pure improvisation. So it's not surprising that he might suddenly forget that there's someone else here to play.
Right.
We got a question here from Ryan Taylor. What are the bonus tracks and how they were selected? Well, the bonus tracks are another rendition of I'm an Old Cowhand, and another one for There Is No Greater Love, and two other takes of Way Out West. So, dual question here for you, Neil. How do you feel about releasing bonus tracks for recordings that were done many years ago? Those of us who are interested in everything an artist has done, that's one thing, but sometimes artists choose specifically what they want to use on a recording and may or not be around for deciding which bonus tracks to use. And the second part of that question is, how were the bonus tracks selected for this recording?
Well, let me take the second part first. The bonus tracks were selected because these were the ones that were there. I don't believe that there was anything that's now been left out, or if it is, it must have been really unsatisfying, because my understanding was these were just the things that were left. A couple of them had been already issued on the CD reissue of the LP in the first place. So a couple of those had been out, and presumably with Sonny's blessing, since he was, his career was in full flight when that came out. I never heard that he was annoyed or disappointed about the presence of these. I would think that he might not ever be, because when you listen to them, even if they're not, even if for some reason they're not as satisfying as the one that was released, they're never bad. And the flip side of that is Sonny Rollins almost never says that what he played was terribly good. He says, well, it was, I think it came out okay. But he does not, pardon the pun, blow his own horn. And he doesn't come out and say, wow, this was perfect and I can't do any better. He's always talking about doing better. He's always talking about learning and hearing more. And the humility with which he approaches his career is it's such a polar opposite from how the rest of the world sees his career as one of the great geniuses of any kind of music in the 20th century. So I think it's all part of a process for him. I'm glad to have these. You can hear why they chose the one they did, but to hear the process of how a tune develops, or how something in this one wasn't quite as on target as the one that was actually released, and yet you hear music that moves you and that tells you something, that to me is never a bad thing, in Sonny Rollins' case.
Yeah, I found with most reissues that bring alternative takes, the interesting thing is you hear the process itself. Right. I know many artists, Miles being one of them, always believe the first take was the best one, but other people work differently, and they may do 4 or 5 takes to get to the place that they really like. I just thought of a corollary thing. Filmmaker Stanley Kubrick was famous for doing multiple takes, and in the movie Eyes Wide Shut, when he was working with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, some of the shots he had like 125 different takes.
Yeah,
that's a whole lot of takes. But getting back to, I'm sorry.
On the other side of that, the filmmaker who might be most associated with jazz and who does play jazz piano, Clint Eastwood, is famous for not making a lot of takes, for doing very few takes. He leaves very little on the cutting room floor. So he's thinking more like Miles. Yeah.
I mean, everyone's got their own way to work. Clint Eastwood is an excellent filmmaker. Stanley Kubrick is an excellent filmmaker. So whatever works.
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever works. That's great. Can you comment? This is a question from Casper Tranberg. Can you comment on why the standard Sonny Rollins is made up of several sessions and different lineups? Did Rollins owe RCA an album, or was he experimenting and had full control of that release? Do you know about that release, Neil?
I know the release. I don't know the details behind it, so that's something that would be worth finding out. I don't know that he necessarily owed them an album, but I suspect that there were alternate takes, and at some point when he went into his second sabbatical in the late 1960s, RCA probably had a bunch of music and people saying, well, how come there are no new Sonny Rollins albums? I'm conjecturing, but that would make sense, that they would have said, well, we have some stuff that we can put out here. I don't know why the original Standards album is made up of several takes, but it might be related to that as well. He could have played these for different recordings, different projects, and then they cobbled them together.
Yeah, and then sometimes after an artist leaves a label, there's a disconnect, and the label just keeps, producing recordings accordingly. But on that track, at Concord and Kraft, there's a producer who takes great pride and a lot of attention to detail, and is very concerned about the artist. And he produced this reissue, and his name is Nick Phillips. Can you say something about Nick?
I can't say too much about Nick because there's by which I mean anything I say won't be enough. He's a good friend of mine. He's a wonderful guy. He's a strong trumpet player. He's an excellent producer. He's been involved with the Recording Academy, which is where we first met, the Grammys for many years, where he's been a very wise voice in deliberations about the awards in general and the jazz categories in particular. And it's a great pleasure to work with him always. And because he is a musician and because he is very punctilious about details, he really does do exactly what you said. He looks through these things, and in pulling together some extra tracks, if Nick's involved, you don't have to worry that there's going to be something embarrassing to the artist. It's just not going to happen.
Absolutely. Nick, I don't know if you're watching, but we love your work, man.
Yeah.
Question from Santiago Aristuit. I can't pronounce his last name, from Argentina.
Okay.
Nita, what do you think about the version of Solitude on Way Out West?
Oh, that's great. It's just beautiful. It's so, it's a little more up-tempo than you would expect from this great Duke Ellington ballad. I don't think Duke Ellington ever played it with that little bit of a bounce, but it certainly works. It gives it this a little more urgency, and it makes it, I think, a little more fit for the 1950s and the hard bop scene, but it doesn't lose the essential impact of the song itself, which is encapsulated in the title. It's a very meditational and very inner-directed song, and the performance, I think, conveys that while bringing it into what was then the present.
Yeah. Now, Neil, you're back on the radio. You're doing a lot of radio, in fact, at this point, and you're in touch with a lot of new releases and things. From what you hear, do you hear much of Sonny Rollins, tenor saxophone, in young musicians today? I do. There's a few in particular. I think the reason you don't hear it more is that it's hard to do. I mean, you could copy some of Sonny Rollins' phrases, but they'd be clearly Sonny Rollins' phrases. And to get the essence of what Sonny does is to put all this together and let his personality shine so much through it. His penchant for humor, self-deprecating humor, power, not anger, but standing up for when something needs to be stood up for. I hear all that in his music, and so for somebody to actually cop what he's doing, you'd almost have to be Sonny Rollins. But in terms of the strictly musical things that he does, I hear that in an artist I'm going to hear tonight, actually, at Symphony Center in Chicago, Melissa Aldana, who won the Monk competition, and she is from Chile. I think the question there was from Santiago, and I certainly hear some Sonny Rollins and some Chris Potter, a few other people, as she is bringing these influences in. For so long, most
tenor players ran after John Coltrane. That was the thing to do. Coltrane was so powerful. He died. He became a cult figure, which takes nothing away from his musicality, of course. I mean, I'm just saying that in addition to everything he brought to it musically, he became a figure that was beloved by all kinds of people who might not have even been into most jazz. And this was during the time that Sonny Rollins was taking some time off. So I think for a lot of young tenor players coming up in the 70s, it wasn't so much about Sonny, but about John Coltrane and his influence on musicians such as Michael Brecker, who then became the avatar of a whole new generation of tenor converts. So I think now people are going back to hear more of Sonny Rollins. The person that I probably hear it the most in, even though he's not playing a single lick from Sonny Rollins' repertoire, is Chris Potter, who I think is doing with his completely original language and in our contemporary times. I think he's approaching improvisation very much the way Sonny Rollins did in the 50s and 60s, in the sense that he is diving in deep and opening it up and showing what can be done with that kind of, as you said, almost meditational focus on developing a theme in the course of improvising, developing a statement that continues to unwind rather than a series of unrelated riffs and phrases. That's not something that Sonny did. That's not something that Chris Potter does. And so I think of them in the same breath without actually tying anything specific about their technique together.
Absolutely. Hello to viewers from Lagos, Nigeria, Lisbon, Portugal. Here's one, Rabbit Hash, Tennessee, Cookie Town, Oklahoma. We got a very diverse audience on here, Neil. Question about, aside, for instance, from Alan Kaplansky, aside from the Way Out West reissue, is Sonny planning to release any CD compilations of live recordings? Yes, he is. I can answer that question. He has an archive of concerts that he recorded during the last 20, 25 years he's performing, that he's released road shows, volume 1, 2, 3. So there's a lot of incredible performances, and I'm sure, I can't give you a date, but they will definitely be released. Question from Ryan Taylor. You did an interview with Sonny for the liner notes. What are his thoughts on the reissue?
Well, what I was saying about him being so humble, I asked him about it. I said, this is so amazing, and what do you think of it at this point? You made the recording. It'll be 60 years earlier, and it's been lionized and it's been praised. And I'll give you the quote. He said, I'm not a good guy for praising or appreciating my own work. That's the reason I like to practice, to get better, to get to the next album. I said, yeah, it was okay. I had some great people. It was a unique concept. I'm glad I did it. And then William Claxton, that iconic photo. I'm glad it happened. But other than that, I'm not good at rating it. So, I mean, that's Sonny. That's the humility I was talking about earlier.
Yes, I think that you're not going to find Sonny Rollins sitting at home listening to his recordings. That's
Right.
something that I know when he releases a new recording and he's working on it, that's something else, especially the way things are done today. But past recordings, as you've said, he's a work in progress.
Always.
It's like Sonny Rollins is one of those people, he's climbing a mountain, a very steep peak, but he's not looking at the top. He's enjoying and trying to progress every step of the way.
Yeah, and he's definitely not looking down either at the past at the steps he's taken.
Yeah. Another comment from Ryan Taylor says he hears a lot of Sonny and Joshua Redman. Perhaps.
I think I'm sure Joshua Redman has listened to Sonny Rollins. I guess now that you mention it, I can hear some aspect of that. Yeah.
I mean, for my ears, it's not so much hearing young musicians try to get to Sonny's sound or his licks or anything, but more, I would say, a melodic inspiration.
Yeah, that's it.
To really get to the melody, because I'm a filmmaker, and we always say most important thing is the story. And in music, I feel the most important thing is the melody. Everything comes from there. And Sonny Rollins has a database of melodies in his head that he's assembled, from the time he was a kid, when he first heard music on the radio to going to the movies. He was living in Harlem, in New York City, during a golden era. When he was a teenager, he passed by Coleman Hawkins walking on the street, a man he idolized. Yep. He was at Minton's Playhouse when bebop was born with Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Thelonious Monk and Kenny Clark. And he was around during that golden era of 52nd Street when so much so much great music was happening. So he is a living compendium of jazz history, and I think that comes through his music. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, of course. And what also gets me when you talk about the melodies is not just the melodies that he's stockpiled and that he remembers and brings out in bits and pieces, but the new melodies that he creates that, sometimes he'll play something, and there's, a half a dozen records I could point to, where he'll play something as part of an improvisation that you think, well, why didn't somebody just write that down and make a new song out of that? He's created a riff, he's played it twice, all it needs is a bridge, and it's another new song, and it happens often, because it's not just that he's recycling the melodies. As you know, he is crafting new ones, and not just riffs and flurries of notes, melodic statements that stand on their own. The idea of spontaneous composition, which is a good definition of improvisation, is especially well served by hearing Sonny Rollins' music.
Absolutely. That's one of the most unique things about jazz, that our major improvisers can spontaneously create these compositions which stand up on their own outside of that individual improvisation. Right. Fantastic. Well, I want to thank Mr. Neil Tesser, fabulous writer, wonderful broadcaster. Neil, this new program that you're doing, where can people hear it? Is it online? Do they hear it locally? What's the deal with that?
It's a funny situation. They can't hear it online from the network source, but they can hear it online if they find any of the stations that are airing it. And there are 70 stations around the country. Some of the big ones are in Florida, in North Carolina. I know Blue Ridge Public Radio, big jazz station in Denver, KCSM in San Mateo up by San Francisco. These are stations that are running it regularly in the evening. So if you were to go to any of their websites and then just stream that site, that programming, you'd be able to hear it that way.
And what is the name of the program?
It's called, it's so funny, it's called Jazz with Neil Tesser, except when Dee Alexander's on, when it's Jazz with Dee Alexander, except when Dave Schwann is on, when it's Jazz with Dave Schwann. It doesn't really have a name, and the reason for that is many of the different stations will give it their own title when they put it on their schedule. So someplace it's Jazz Overnight, someplace it's Jazz Tonight, someplace it's Late Night Jazz. But when we come on, we basically can just say, this is Jazz with me, because we're not sure what it's being called in any of the different 70 cities where it's being heard.
Well, before we jump off here, I just want to talk about this for a second, because what you're doing is producing syndicated programming, like a net where you are, in essence, a network,
yes,
to provide program for stations that locally might not have the resources or someone like you to do a show like that. And I think this is really important. Yeah.
Largely, the stations that subscribe to this network are stations that are running jazz during the day and would like to keep it on all night, but really can't afford to have two people there all evening. They're public radio stations. The budget is tight. So they subscribe to the service, and we make sure that we're producing programs on a regular basis. These are not all reruns from 8-10 years ago. We're producing programs with recent releases and some historical depth to it, we hope, that people can put on. The idea was that they would put these things on after midnight, but we found a number of stations are putting them on at 9, 10 at night. So it's really kind of, for jazz radio, that's kind of prime time. And they're using these programs in a way that perhaps the original concept of the WFMT Jazz Network did not really foresee. It was supposed to be something to fill in overnight. I think we've now pushed it to the point where many stations are running it and are happy to have their listeners have access to it, not as a stopgap, but as something that's part of their regular programming.
Absolutely. What about reissue liner notes aside from Way Out West? Anything coming out or come out recently that you should like to tell people about, Neil?
Reissues, not so much, because the reissue game is kind of drying up. I mean, labels put out everything they had in various conceivable collections and combinations for so long that largely, I think they're out of it. I think the releases that you're going to see are going to be like this one. They're going to be deluxe sets of vinyl that bring it back to the original, vehicle for hearing the music. And mostly the liner notes I work on are for new recordings.
And what are some of those recordings that you've done that are coming out or have come out recently that people could check out?
I do pretty much all the things for Steeplechase Records in Copenhagen. So on those, I mean, regular people there, and I do them in advance, so it'll take me a minute to remember what's coming out soon. But this weekend I'm working on a liner notes for a Brian Charette album. He's an organist who's very good, working with George Coleman. It's the first tenor saxophone, George Coleman. Tenor saxophonist George Coleman. It's the first album that he's recorded in, I think, 10 years. So looking forward to that. There's things that come out from a Brazilian saxophonist named Ivo Perelman, who I write pretty much all the liner notes for, and he puts out albums at a ferocious pace. They're all free jazz, so it's not like he has to write a song and arrange it and go in the studio and do post-production. These are basically documentations of the different combinations that he's playing in, and I do just about all of those for him. And a number of Chicago artists who know me, so I've worked on a set recently by a singer named Kerry Johnsrud, who put out an album of songs from the pen of Fred Rogers, as in Mr. Rogers. These are jazz versions of Mr. Rogers tunes, and they don't sound like nursery rhymes. I mean, Fred Rogers wrote songs that, yes, were for kids, but it doesn't take much to turn them into songs that are pretty good for adults and pretty swinging for jazz fans. So that's one that's coming out soon, and various others.
Well, we want to thank the always busy Neil Tesser for joining us here today to talk about Way Out West. This reissue will be out next month in a few weeks. And if you're a Sonny Rollins fan, if you like jazz, if you're a saxophone student, or you're just getting into this music, it's great to pick it up.